Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about politics and race. The main points that we're going to cover today, we're going to look at the social movements to end prejudice and discrimination by groups such as African Americans, Native Americans, Chicanos, Arab Americans, and Asian Americans. We're going to look at the white backlash to Reconstruction and also Civil Rights Movement. We're going to look at how the American electorate, especially the higher political levels, are underrepresented. We're going to look at politics and how they're often racially polarized. We're going to look at voting patterns and turnout by race, also political campaigns that were historically class-based but over time have been highly influenced by race-based ideas. This is also known as dog whistle politics, the implicit suggestions of putting a race down. So the history of race is incredibly intense, and I'm not going to go super deep into the entire social movements, but if you ever get a chance to take the sociology of social movements, what an incredible class. I mean, you delve very deep into the civil rights movements, all the national and global movements that occur. Really, really good class. That also kind of ties into violence and terrorism a little bit because, again, those are also social movements. So the book starts talking about history of race and the idea of black disenfranchisement. And again, to be able to open up this lecture, we have to just go back to all of our previous lectures and how economics is often the core of race. So remember, you have the bourgeoisie, the landowners, the capitalists trying to suppress all the working classes into the lower class and remove them from being able to compete. So even after the Emancipation Proclamation, in which Lincoln freed the slaves, still you had this economic oppression that continued. And this didn't just end, after the Civil War and then, after the Civil Rights Movement. This continues up until to modern times. And again, this is the example that I often talk about, but who gets the job? Is it someone with a white-sounding name or a black-sounding name? Because again, just the culture of your name is associated with whether or not you get a job. That's the idea of white privilege that's built into our system, and it's in the hands of the hiring managers, for example, that kind of covert racism still exists to today. So the idea of black disenfranchisement, again, is removing them from competing. It's whites doing everything to oppress them and keep them down. And it's the idea of making sure that they can't rise up the social class ladder. And this was done both legally and socially for hundreds of years. So even though the 15th Amendment, for example, gave African Americans the right to vote, as your book talks about, the states took other steps to make sure blacks couldn't vote, such as literacy tests. And again, because African Americans were not granted access to education, you had very high literacy rates, and so due to the high illiteracy rates in the African American population, this kept them from voting. After Lincoln was assassinated, the Reconstruction, the idea of bringing up an entire class of people that a race of people that were stuck in the lower classes, this absolutely failed. And in the South, Jim Crow was implemented. And Jim Crow were just all these social mechanisms by which they kept a black man down, for example. I mean, if I were a black man and it was 1940s, 1950s, and a white man was coming down the street, I would have been expected to go to the other side of the street. Okay? Segregation was placed during this time. Even though slavery ended, you still had the segregation of people into race-based groups, and this involved where you could sit on a bus, what restaurant you could eat in, what bathroom you could use, what water you could drink out of. I mean, very extensive segregation was put in place. The book talks about the example of Mississippi, where non-whites were given way less money. I think it was like 200% less, pretty much, than whites did at the time. And again, this unequal funding was another way to keep African Americans down, to keep their school systems not good. And then the segregated culture stuck them in areas that were impoverished. And then they weren't able to get jobs because of Jim Crow and segregation and other forms of racism. And so whites were given more opportunity in this than non-whites, and this was done on a legal basis, okay? Because of the economic exploitation after slavery, even though African Americans were free, they still live in a capitalist system. And in this capitalist system, you either need to be an owner or you have to be a worker. And so since African Americans had no access to good jobs, especially in the South, they had to go back to working on the plantations that they just, that they once were slaves on. And this became the idea of sharecropping, which is just another form of informal slavery. Yes, you don't own them anymore legally, but at the same time you own them like your manager has power over you at your job. They have the ability to pay you. They decide how much they're going to pay you, etc. So this was just another way to keep African Americans stuck in the lower classes. And so when you start to look at it, what you realize is non-whites, as all non-white races, were stuck in the lower classes. And prejudice and discrimination was utilized by which to keep them in the lower classes. And you also, it's not this class, but women also were stuck in the lower classes. Yes, women could benefit from their husband's socioeconomic status, but women during this time, they had no socioeconomic status. Even their citizenship rights were owned by the man. Like when a man got married to a woman, after Civil War, the female became the citizen of the man. So again, these are all the mechanisms by which white males or European males were able to oppress entire groups of people, including socially constructed racial groups, ethnic groups, and females in the lower classes. Okay? Just really quick, your book does have an example of the literacy test. So here's the example of the Louisiana literacy test. Make sure you guys look at some of these pictures in the book. I'm going to show a couple because they're really powerful, but just to give you an idea of what is going on there. Okay? So violence against blacks. And again, we're in sociology. And when you really delve in, not all society is pretty. So again, the disclaimer in this class is a lot of these subjects are really tough. It's hard to talk about some of this stuff. But violence against blacks is just an incredibly depressing, dark part of American history, but it really shows you what racism looks like. So the book talks about all of these examples. Henry Bedford, 72-year-old man, spoke disrespectfully to a white man, was killed. J.B. Grant, 17, shot 100 times by a lynch mob and hung on a railroad trestle. Charlie Lang and Ernest Green, 14, tortured, castrated, murdered for alleged rape of a white girl. They were innocent. The kids were just playing. Emmett Till, 14, kidnapped, beaten, testicles removed, shot him, and tossed him in a river. It was the murder of Emmett Till that really catalyzes the civil rights movement because they took his body back to Chicago and they had an open casket. Thousands of people came and walked by the open casket. Then Life magazine took a picture and they put it on the cover of a 1950s magazine, which was incredibly taboo to even show that kind of thing. But look, people saw what racism really looked like for the first time. So again, I'm just going to go back to the book really quick. And this is the murder of Emmett Till. This is the open casket in Chicago. YouTube has videos of this. If you get a chance, you can see the crowds walking through. Just incredibly sad. Like, I'm kind of crying right now. All right. So, but the murder of Emmett Till is what is credited as kind of being that tipping point. And after this is when you have the bus boycotts in Montgomery that begins the really big parts of the civil rights movement. So the civil rights movement, in the book's straight-up definition, is a collection of organizations of people who carried out political acts aimed at abolishing racial segregation, non-white disenfranchisement, again, keeping them in the lower classes, and economic exploitation, making capital on their backs without them getting any benefits. The civil rights movement did succeed in ending Jim Crow. It succeeded in ending the legalized segregation. It resulted in the integration of schools. But this is also a time when the white flight happened from the city. So all the cities emptied out of the white people because they didn't want their children going to school with non-whites, so they moved out to the suburbs. And this is what happened to the cities during the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, was that the only thing that was left in the cities were people that were in the lower classes. That's why you have high crime rates and things and high drug use and stuff in the cities during this time. And the cities were a little bit rough because the only people left were the people either stuck in the lower classes. And then remember, all races that were non-white were stuck in the lower classes. Okay, and this is just another way by which whites continued segregation. Even though it wasn't legal, what they did was they moved to the all-white rich suburbs where you had to have a bunch of money to pay the high taxes to get out there. And this is how neighborhoods then continue to be segregated for a long time. Again, I'm not going to go super deep into how urbanization works and how racially segregated neighborhoods exist in modern times. We're going to talk about that a little bit later, but just to get you thinking about that. So again, the murder of Emmett Till the sparks catalyzes the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King and entire whole bunch of groups of people all get together. They do the Montgomery bus boycott, and this is where they go after the economics as a way by which to change society. So the bus company, I forget which bus, I think it was maybe Greyhound or something, but whoever owned the buses in Montgomery, they relied heavily on African American riders for their money. So the African Americans knew that it would hurt their pocketbook if they stopped riding the buses. So they all got together and they worked out ride shares, and they stopped using the buses. And this went on for about a year. But eventually it hurt their pocketbook so much that they had to end the idea that a black person had to sit in the back of the bus. Again, all started in December 1st with Rosa Parks beginning the bus boycott. So she decided to sit on the front of the bus because her feet hurt and she was tired. She didn't want to walk all the way to the back of the bus. And that was just, one little stance that leads to the bus boycotts that a year later opens up the idea that a black person has to go back to the back of the bus. But again, it's economics somehow. That's just a key theme going on here. You have a lot of organizations that have been fighting for racial equality for a long time. The NAACP has been around for a long time. There's a word in here that I don't even think I can say, but if you guys read it, that's again the book's quote. And this has been around for over 120 years. I think it's like 1909 or something that the NAACP was began, and they've been fighting for racial equity for a long time. During the 1960s, you had the SCLC really stepping up, and that's what Martin Luther King was a part of. You had the student activism in the form of SNCC. But you also have a whole changing in the psychology of people at this time. Okay, so I'm a huge fan of the book Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, but Ralph Ellison, the author, goes to World War II and fights for his country. And, when African Americans fought for their country, they expected to come back as heroes, and they expected to be treated as American citizens. Here they were standing up for their country. But when they came back, they were faced again with segregation and complete overt racism. So you started to have this change in the African American psyche of disillusionment. Okay, so this disillusionment compounded with, I'm sure, anger and frustration and being able to look at the American dream but not being allowed to access it based upon the color of your skin. This really stirs a lot of people's pot. Same thing for women. They wanted the right to vote. They wanted to become doctors and lawyers. They were done being stuck in the house, being oppressed by the man. So the civil rights movement starts to draw in tons of groups, and then it starts to bring in the ethnicities. The Asian Americans are upset that their citizenship was taken away, and the Arab Americans don't like the negative views that they're looked at. And so the anti-Arab sentiment, they start fighting against. And so you just start to see all these kind of social movements coming together in the civil rights movements. It's a racial movement, it's an ethnic movement, it's a sex movement, and then sexuality, okay? So then you have that whole movement coming out that really culminates in the 2000s, for example. But you did have some big marches. You had the Selma to Montgomery March, the March on Washington, and again, Martin Luther King gets assassinated. And again, it's during that time and after the passage of the civil rights that you start to ask questions, because the movement itself kind of ends. And so the civil rights movement did not completely end racism. It did not end prejudice and discrimination. It did not end sexism. It did not end heterosexism. It did not end ethnocentrism. These things still continue to this day. Again, the movement is not over. Native Americans. So again, the treatment of Native Americans goes way back. White settlers came over. They started imposing on Native American lands. They violate treaties. They go to war. They spread guns, germs, and steel. They impose cultural imperialism where they decimate entire cultures and try to force them to become white, live a white culture, an English way of life. Okay, you had the book doesn't go super deep into all these cultures. I'm going to put up some other videos that just specifically talk about each culture. I have a whole bunch of them for you guys. But just really quick, I'm going to cover what the book covers, which is the Indian Termination Act. This was the forced assimilation by removing tribal status. Again, this resulted in white land grabbing of Native American lands and it forced Native Americans into poverty because the only land they had left wasn't really there's no real utility to that land. They gave them the worst land, and they basically expected them to jump into an economic system that's capitalist and do a white way of life, for example. So you had a lot of backlash to this. You had the American Indian movement of 1968. This spurns a lot of the Native American rights movements in the trying to spread awareness of Native American issues. The Bureau of Indian Affairs that was supposed to be able to take care of the Native Americans, it was a complete epic fail. Again, Native Americans have the highest rates of poverty and lack of medical care, etc. All of this probably due to the imposing upon white culture and the taking of the land, and then the failure of the government to be able to take care of groups of people. You had a week-long takeover by Native Americans when they took over the Bureau of Indian Affairs just to really protest and demonstrate. This was defined as an act of civil disobedience, but, was it? This is the Bureau that's supposed to be taking care of them. You had the takeover of Alcatraz in 1969 to spread awareness of Native American rights. They were not granted what they actually wanted, but it still spread awareness. That lasted for 14 months. The book also introduces a great concept called pan-ethnicity. And what you're going to find is this is what actually races are. They're not races. Most things are pan-ethnicities, grouping of all people from Latin America, South America, the Caribbean into one group trying to call them Hispanic. But they're just such a blend of cultures and skin colors and countries of origin. That's the idea of pan-ethnicity, putting all Asians into one category. What does someone from India have in common with someone from China, for example? Do they look the same? Is the culture the same? Why are they all grouped as Asians? And then why aren't Russians grouped as Asians? And so white is also a pan-ethnicity. White is not a race. It's a pan-ethnicity. It's a grouping of people from all kinds of countries, from every single continent on the planet, that crosses the entire planet. It goes from Asia with Russians to Europe, which is not even a continent, which is also part of Asia, to North America, to South America. It's just ridiculous. So again, the Supreme Court is very clear that you are not white if you think you're white. White's not a race. It's a pan-ethnicity. The Supreme Court has ruled on this, okay? Check out the Supreme Court case. It's really good. So you had the Chicano movement, and again, this is linked to, the migrant workers. And so you had, all the races that were not white were stuck in the lower classes. That meant they were doing the work of field hands and farm workers and factory workers and all the lower class jobs. So Cesar Chavez unites Latin Americans into this farm workers union, culminated in the Delano grape strike of 1965. But really, the Chicano movement, and again, what's the proper word here every time I say Chicano? Because Cesar Chavez was Mexican. And so, again, how far do we include Chicanos? Is that a pan-ethnicity? Is it Latin American? Is it Latinos and Latinas? Is it just Mexicans and Ecuadorians? What's the proper word here? It's just, again, the political ideas, but the battling against oppressive labor conditions, the economic exploitations, the owner versus the laborer, the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. This just keeps coming up. Again, so the capital of the capitalists is built on the backs of the laborers. The owners make capital by the laborers selling their labor. Okay? And so, again, the concept of economics is at the heart of race, because the whole goal of Europeans was to put non-Europeans into the lower classes. So this meant that all non-light-skinned people, all non-Europeans, all non-whites got stuck into the lower classes, and those are the jobs they were stuck taking. So Arab Americans, same thing. They were sick of the prejudice and discrimination. They were sick of the anti-Arab sentiment. So they organized in the 1960s to overcome this, to make a better name for themselves, to show Americans that we're, just great people with an incredibly rich history. And so they just want to overcome these negative perspectives, okay? Remember that whites are way more likely to be a terrorist than anybody else. Whites are more likely to be criminals and in poverty and on food stamps than anybody else. Asian Americans, again, same thing, spoke out against economic exploitation and racism, challenging this Eurocentric worldview that tries to decimate, Asian culture and force them to assimilate into a white way of life. They're challenging these cultural distortions by Americans. Think about how the cartoons used to portray Asians, for example, very offensive. This was culminated in the student movement. I like how your book talked about the Third World Liberation from the 1960s, because, again, you have a lot of these youth movement activisms and then a lot of other groups that really have an impact. White backlash. Civil Rights Act did not end prejudice and discrimination. Again, you started to see coded and overt language to organize white supremacists to vote together, for example, with the George Wallace in Alabama, like your book talks about. Non-whites were blamed for social problems like crime and poverty, and again, statistics say whites are more likely to be criminals and be in poverty, like twice as much as anybody else. People became polarized around racially charged politics. Republicans started to appeal to whites and Democrats to non-whites for voting. Colorblind racism came into suit when the idea is that even though the Civil Rights Act occurred, that doesn't mean prejudice and discrimination are gone. But whites like to say, look, we gave you rights, we gave you all the power, what else can we do? That's the idea of colorblind racism. But again, what else can you do is, stop discriminating against people when they're trying to get a house because of their race, because that's what happens. It's in mortgage rates and hiring practices. This is where racism exists in modern times. And then again, you have the covert racism, the very subtle racism. It's hard to be overtly racist in modern times, but everyone's exposed to some sort of subtle racism. And just ask questions like when we study interracial marriages, would everybody in your family be cool if you came home with someone that wasn't of the same race as you? Would everybody in your family be cool if you came home and, said you were marrying somebody of the same sex? It's the same kind of thing. That kind of prejudice still exists in modern times. So again, in modern times, even still, 150 years after the Civil War, you still see a very white, male-dominated hierarchical system when it comes to the elite social positions. But as Sojourner Truth said so well in the 1850s and 60s, how can a white woman talk for a black woman? It's the same thing. The experiences of a white woman and the needs of a white woman might vary very much so from the needs of a black woman. And so if all races, all sexes, all sexualities, genders are not represented, then their needs are not being spoken for. Okay? You do see a lot of race-based gerrymandering, so whenever they're trying to redraw the political lines, they try to draw the maps secretly, and this happened for a long time. It's illegal, but they try to draw maps in ways that group races together so that they can vote, in the direction that you want to, for example. Your book talks about that. Your book talks about racial influences on voting behavior, again, which is all just cultural attitudes. How is race and culture associated with the way people vote? The black people tend to vote for these and these kinds of ways toward this, and white people tend to that. So the book talks a lot about that. The book talks about elections and how we appeal to certain races during the elections, but then don't care about them the rest of the time. And then the dog whistle politics, an important concept. This is the implicit racial appeals that politicians use toward whites to suggest that other races are threatening to get votes, like associating African Americans with food stamps, for example, even though it's whites that are more likely to be on food stamps, that your book talks about. So again, just to quote your book, racism today is often implicit triggering of deep-seated, not always self-conscious racial fears and antagonisms. Recognize that a lot of racism and the socialization of race happens at an unconscious level. You might not, how did you even find out what race you are? You were a kid when you found out. So it's not like you were thinking about what race am I. You were told you have a race. You're told you belong to this racial group. And this whole class I've been challenging that notion, saying the only group you really belong to is life or humanity. And geneticists have no idea what actual race you are because none of it makes any sense. But yeah, we're still hanging on to our racial identities. We're still letting it influence our decision-making, the way we interact with people, the way we build society. There's a lot to it. Okay? So that's a quick overview. You all have a wonderful day.